Hi there, class. This is the second lecture of the second week of class here, where we ask the question, is God a person? Which is really an interesting question if you stop and think about it. We think of God as fundamentally different and far off from us. Karl Barth is famous for saying God is an infinite qualitative distinction between divinity and humanity. So when we start thinking about, is God a person? It's a really interesting question, not only because we describe God as existing in three persons, but also because we consider ourselves persons. And so getting to the bottom of this and figuring out what it is to be a person is a really interesting thing to explore. Before we dive into that, though, I want to read a quick prayer for us to start off our time. We talked last week a little bit about the Cappadocians who contributed greatly to Trinitarian doctrine and the Council of Nicaea, speaking against Arius, and in the councils that followed. Gregory of Nazianzus was one of those Cappadocians, and this is one of his prayers. O transcendent Almighty God, what words can sing your praises? No tongue can describe you, no mind can probe your mystery. Yet all speech springs from you, and all thought stems from you. All creation proclaims you. All creatures revere you. Every gust of wind breathes a prayer to you. Every rustling tree sings a hymn to you. All things are upheld by you, and they move according to your harmonious design. The whole world longs for you, and all people desire you. Yet you have set yourself apart. You are far beyond our grasp. You are the purpose of all that exists, but you do not let us understand you. Lord, I want to speak to you. By what name shall I call you? What I love about this prayer, especially as it comes to the things that we're going to talk about today, is there's a deep longing within Gregory here to be in relationship with God. What does it mean to call God by name? What does it mean to have a relationship with God? What does it mean to call upon the Creator of all things as a person with whom you commune? And so that's one of the things that hopefully we'll start to touch upon today. So let's start with the first question. What is a person? Well, this was a question that was being asked in the early church and in early philosophy. And so Boethius' definition, Boethius was writing in about 500 AD or CE. Boethius defined a person as an individual substance of a rational nature. Now you can see, once again, substance ontology is coming into this. A person is a substance, as Boethius calls it here. But the problem that arose was that the Christian tradition has emphasized that it is not a substance that gives rise to personhood, but rather that personhood, the specificness of the Father, gives rise to everything that is. And as the culture continued to look at personhood in relationship to substances, these things came into conflict and changed shape as they were brought in dialogue with one another. One of the things that I also want to point out about Boethius's statement here is a person is an individual substance of a rational nature. And so there became a debate about what it means for a person to be rational, for an individual to be rational. And ultimately it ended up that if one could not be defined as rational, that meant that they did not have personhood. And this was the rise of racism in a lot of ways, where individual communities were thought to be savages. They were not rational. They were, and because of that, they were defined as less than human, less than a person, and were able to be subjected to oppression and different other things. Definitions matter, is where I'm going with this. And this definition, how it took hold in the culture, affected a lot of things. So Trinitarian thought within the church struggled to understand the ways in which God could be thought of as three persons using this definition, right? That's a fundamental problem. The problem is that the understanding of the self became wrapped into our idea of personhood. And a self is an individual center of consciousness with an individual identity serving as an independent moral agent. If that's the definition of a person, then the three persons of God would make us tritheists rather than Trinitarian. Tritheist means that we would believe in three gods who are somehow allied or joined to each other, rather than one God who exists in three persons. And so the church struggled with how to adopt Boethius's definition without falling into the trap of tritheism. A self in modern understanding largely follows Descartes. And Descartes, by the way, followed Augustine on Augustine's psychological model of the Trinity in saying, I think, therefore I am. If you're familiar with Descartes, he's arguing that at this point in Descartes' work, he's arguing that how is it that he can come to know anything? He's imagining that a demon or a devil is deceiving him about everything around him, about his house, about the food that he's eating, about the job that he has. The devil is deceiving him about anything, and he's wondering how he can figure out the truth if a powerful demon is deceiving him. And he eventually says, I can't trust my food, I can't trust my desk, I can't trust my house, I can't trust my government, I can't trust the weather outside. What can I trust? And he eventually narrows it down to a question about himself. Can I even trust that I exist? And as he gets to thinking about this problem, he says, of course I can know that I exist. And that's maybe the only thing that I know. And the reason that I can know that is I think. And if I think, that means that I exist. I think, therefore I am. He decides that in the end, no matter what, he knows that he exists because he can think. I think, Descartes argues, therefore I know that I exist. To know anything in Descartes, to know anything in John Locke, to know anything in Gottfried Leibniz, that was about self-awareness apart from anything else. These early modern philosophers defined the self in a very individualistic fashion. And this marks a particular shift in how the cosmos was thought about. In ancient times, like we talked about in the last lecture, there was an appeal to substances. We knew about things from substances. And we talked about things as the supreme substance or the ultimate substance. In the turn to modernity, whenever we left some of the ancient ways of thinking behind and entered into early modernity, things became defined as they were thought of within the self, within the individual subject. And so substance ontology, where we could define everything in terms of substances, it gave way to a search for the absolute subject instead. So just as it was thought that God could be proven as the prime mover and the supreme substance, right? Remember we talked about things bumped into each other, and if you have substance that bumped into each other and act in very particular ways, then you can trace yourself all the way back to the prime mover, which would be called the supreme substance. Now, in the early modern era, it was thought that God could be proved through an appeal to subjectivity. That we know we exist as individuals because God exists as the absolute subject through which and by which all other subjects get their personhood. So the analogy between substance and subjects was very, very tight, actually, or maybe I should say the correspondence between substances and subjects was actually very, very tight. There's an alignment between the two. But Descartes makes the mistake that's often made in modern thought, that we can separate things out as individual things that exist apart from other things. For Descartes, he feels that a self can exist apart from real relationships with anything else, that you can just sort of strip something off as this independent thing and define it as it is that way. Now, there are all kinds of problems with that. Can things truly exist apart from one another? Right? The short answer to that in late modern thought is probably not. There are all kinds of problems with the concept of absolute subject. Lacuna walks through a lot of those, so please spend time focusing on that and trying to understand that in the chapter. But the upshot of all this, my summary of how Lacuna walks us through this, is that we can only talk about God by talking about ourselves as unique, disconnected individuals. That's what it means to appeal to God as the absolute subject. We can only talk about God by talking about ourselves as unique, disconnected individuals, which made doctrines about God really about statements about ourselves. Right? When we talk about ourselves as individuals who are stripped off and independent from anything else, we also talk about God as an individual who's stripped off and separate from anything else. And because of that, talk about a Trinitarian God didn't make sense anymore. We couldn't figure out how to talk about a Trinitarian God, and so doctrine about the Trinity was relegated to, the last chapters in books and appendices and, footnotes at the bottom of pages. Instead, throughout Christian history, the church has struggled to maintain the doctrine that the outworking of who we are and what we believe only happens in Christian community, not as a bunch of disconnected individuals, but Christians who are operating together. We define ourselves in relationship with each other and with God. That's what the church has historically believed. With this cultural shift, that made it really hard to figure out how to do that in a way that was that sort of matched with the modern thinking in the culture. Now remember, the church had social and relational understanding fused with their substance ontology. We talked about that a little bit in the last lecture. And that served as a protection between this sort of the sort of thing that I'm talking about, that individual subjects and individual substances could be stripped off from anything else and analyzed on their own. But as time marched on, the idea of a person and a self was separated from the social and communal aspect and made about individual subjectivity as isolated from all other things. If Augustine's psychological model was kept, and that was the primary doctrine of the church because it was picked up by Aquinas a bit later, if Augustine's psychological model was kept, this new understanding of the person as a single individual entity as defined and stripped off from all other things, it made Christians tritheists. And that was a problem because Christians have never agreed that we worship three gods, three separate gods who are kind of in association with each other. But if the idea of individual subjects was accepted, then the Trinity was just a speculative dogma, right? Our talk about the Trinity was really talk about ourselves, and since every one of us has a different talk about ourselves, all of our talks about the Trinity become different, and so it doesn't make sense to talk about the Trinity in any concrete fashion anymore. And when we do that, a speculative dogma of the Trinity can be set aside because it was divorced from relationality and from communion with one another. And that's the state of things in Trinitarian doctrine for a long time, for maybe close to 300 years, from about 1600 till about 1850 is really how long this thing lasted, where we were focused on individuals as stripped off and isolated from anything else, and no one could make any sense of Trinitarian doctrine during that time frame. It wasn't until theologians like Karl Barth and Karl Rahner, it wasn't until they came on the scene that things started to change. But Karl Barth and Karl Rahner, they were affected by a very narrow understanding of what it meant to be a person or what it meant to be the self. And so in the wake of their struggles, theologians started to figure out, like, really the problem is we need to figure out better what it means to be a person. And so that's where development of the idea of personhood really emerges into the forefront. That started about 1850, and it really started to make a big difference in the 20th century. Lacuna walks through the options of, in the modern age, what it means to define oneself as a person. And her description of that is really good, very academic, and it goes through a series of different thinkers on this point. I encourage you to go and read that. But what I want to emphasize and summarize from that reading is that all of the modern thinkers who worked on what it meant to be a person, they turned away from the understanding of person in the context of an isolated individual, and they turned towards defining personhood as fundamentally relational. Personhood is only achieved in communion with other persons. That's the late modern thinking about what it means to be a person. Broadly speaking, this is called the late modern turn to relationality. It's a philosophical concept. Lots of books have been written about it that you can go and explore on your own. But in the turn to relationality, most things, especially people, are thought of in a complex network of relationships, in complex contexts that helps an individual figure out who they are, where they belong, what their values are, and how they'll live. Think about it. We know, for instance, that when, in the extremely rare cases that we have children, for instance, that are raised by themselves, by wolves or by monkeys, their identity and their sociality is very, very strange and different, right? They are defined by their context in some key ways, despite the fact that they still share, a human genetic imprint. On the other hand, we, as people who exist in a certain kind of social network, we have values that are reinforced by that network. We gain our identity from that network. And in that way, that means that we are fundamentally relational, that there is relationality that defines who we are. That's the sort of way that relationality works. And as a matter of fact, if you think about ecosystems in nature, if you think about how the weather works and how it is informed in relationship with all kinds of things, like ocean currents, like the intensity of the sun, like the ways that the wind is blowing, like, all kinds of other things. All things exist in a complex network of relationships. The turn to relationality says we cannot consider things like a rainstorm in isolation. A rainstorm only exists in relationship to other things. Now, early in this turn to relationality, a few thinkers tried to explain it. Right? They tried to use the language that they had available with them at the time to try to explain what we meant by relationality. But they struggled because of how entrenched isolated substances and isolated subjectivity affected their thinking. Søren Kierkegaard, in his book The Sickness Unto Death, tries to describe it this way. The self is a relation which relates itself to its own self, or it is that in the relation that the relation relates itself to its own self. The self is not the relation, but that the relation relates itself to its own self. Right? This is the sort of language that happened. This was written in about 1850, I think. This is the sort of language that was used early on in the turn to relationality to try to describe what was going on. Fundamentally, what Søren Kierkegaard is saying here is the self is a fundamentally relational construct where the self is a relationship that only exists in relationship to other selves, and you can't isolate it to just the relationship. You have to isolate it to relationships that are in relationship, right? Everything's in relationship, and that's where the self comes from. This is what the modern turn to relationality means. Now, as theologians especially were embracing this turn to relationality, they went back and they looked at Christian history, and they found lots of evidence that in Christian history, especially pretty early times, that these concepts undergirded a lot of the early concepts within the church. Most specifically, the divine communion of persons as perichoresis was retrieved from John Damascene. And so he described the Trinity in the early 8th century with the term perichoresis, and that highlights that there are three divine persons that permanently exist within one another. They draw life from one another, and they're defined in relation to one another. Specifically, what he was trying to do was describe the Trinitarian God in terms that avoided the pitfalls of tritheism. So even though he was working in about 700 before the modern turn, tritheism remained a problem in Trinitarian doctrine that he was trying to navigate. So he was trying to avoid the pitfalls of tritheism on the one side, and he was trying to avoid subordination on the other side. Perichoresis highlights that the three divine persons permanently exist within one another, they draw life from one another, and they're defined as what they are in relationship to one another. With this way of talking about God, the three persons mutually interpenetrate each other, and they sustain each other with a never-ending flow of divine energy. Sometimes this is referred to as a divine dance in which the persons of the Trinity share in each other's energy and their vitality for eternity. Now, what's critical for perichoresis, aside from the idea of relationality, is that there's a complete lack of compulsion or dominance in this perichoretic relationship. This mutual interpenetration and mutual sharing of life is an incredibly intimate encounter in which all fear is banished because there is no dominance. There is no compulsion to it. There is only a flow of love that gives life among the persons. Each person has their specific and individual distinctiveness, which is what the hypostasis describes that we talked about last time. but they are also not separated in their consciousness or will, which is what the unity of the ousia describes. So perichoresis is a way in which John Damascene was trying to figure out how to describe what was happening. How could these three persons exist in both a unity and in both their threeness? And his argument is they interpenetrate each other. That does not mean that they lose their uniqueness, but rather they share in something that's much greater in their deep relationship. Now, Trinitarian theology at the level of economia, remember that from from the stuff we read in Lacuna on the first week. Trinitarian theology at the level of economia argues that things have their being as they are relational, as they relate to other things. And as it comes to God, God exists because God is persons in communion. Right? Persons who are in eternal relationship with one another in an everlasting embrace, in an everlasting dance, in an everlasting communion. Both this relationality and this communion are a part of God's character. Now, we need to think about that in terms of last week. Remember what I said, how is it that God is actually free? God is free to express God's character. A truly free person no longer has to choose to do one thing over another. A truly free person just follows their character. Relationality and communion are part of God's character, which is freely shared in creation, right? God wants to be in communion with not only with the other persons of the Trinity, but God is infinitely creative in the way that God reaches out in communion, which is where creation comes from, which is where redemption comes from, which is where our incorporation into God's blessed kingdom comes from. Our human relationship and communions are reflections of God's own character. We are made in the image of God because we are also relational. And our relationships are supposed to be in the image of God, right? Conformed to Christ and how Christ had his relationships on earth. So let's go back to the question about whether God is a person. If we define a person as Boethius does, a single substance of a rational nature, then the answer is most likely no. God is not a person. Right? A person in isolation, apart from a communion with others, who is self-made and self-defined, does not describe God. Right? That's not historically what the church has thought. Instead, repeatedly throughout church history, God has been considered fundamentally relational and social in nature. God is three persons who mutually reinforce one another, who give each other unique identities like Father, Son, Spirit, Word, things like that. And they give life to each other in an eternal dance of creativity and vitality. So if we shift the definition of person to be significantly relational, like those thinkers that Lacuna walks us through, that personhood is only achieved in communion with other persons, then perhaps it does make sense to call God a person, or to say that God exists in three persons. So here, it really matters how we define a person. If a person is an isolated individual with its own independent will, that probably does not describe God. But if we describe a person as fundamentally a relational being who defines itself in relation to others, then we can describe the persons of God that way. And we can say that they share a will and they share agency because of how tight their communion with one another is. That probably does allow us to describe God as a person. And with that in mind, what God has revealed to us at the level of economia, right, what we see in salvation history, is not some shift in substance. And this is key to understanding what salvation is all about in Trinitarian terms. If we think about ourselves as substances who have somehow become vandalized and fouled up because of sin, don't get me wrong, I believe that that's actually the case. We are persons who are incredibly vandalized and fouled up because of sin. But if we think about ourselves only as individual substances that exist in isolation from other things, the point of salvation is that my substance that is dirty would somehow be washed clean. I become a substance still independent, still unique, still with my own will, just clean, right? Just washed up from that sin. But to go that direction with substance ontology, that would be to misunderstand salvation history. God in salvation is trying to draw us back into relationship with the divine perichoretic life where all the members are sustained in communion. If you think about how Paul talks about this, he encourages us to carry one another's burdens. In the Old Testament, it talks about how iron sharpens iron. Paul again talks about how we should laugh with those who laugh and mourn with those who mourn, right? This idea, this deep, intense idea of communion is extremely present in the New and Old Testament. And it's also a sign or a reflection of what it is that God is doing in creation history. It's a fundamentally relational thing. God is trying to draw us back into relationship with the divine perichoretic life where all the members are sustained in communion, where we carry each other's burdens, where we love each other more than we love ourselves. It's through that relationship that we finally become persons who are fully human. We don't become fully human by thinking of ourselves as a substance that's washed clean. We become fully human because we stand in relationship to God, and He calls us His beloved. He calls us His. That is our salvation. Salvation is that God does not hold our transgressions against us, but He calls us back into relationship for His glory and for our joy. And that is how God is for us, right? Which is the name of the book that we're reading of Lacunas, right? God for us. God is for us because God is fundamentally relational and extends that relationship to us. Now, whenever we talk about persons in communion, I'm going to point you back to Lacuna again. Lacuna goes into how persons in communion plays out most poignantly starting on page 288 of the text. And in that section, she just really explores all the facets of how persons in communion can play out. And so I highly recommend that you devote energy to fully understanding that section of the book. So I think that covers it. We talked about is God as a person. Next week, we'll delve into the next chapter of Lacuna's work. And hopefully at this point, we're starting to get into the rhythm of how stuff works. A couple of lectures a week, plenty of reading. And here I'll try to unpack and explain some of the key concepts of Lacuna so that we can have a good framework for moving forward. As usual, make sure you participate in the forum. And if you have any questions, please email me. Have a great day. Bye.